What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more hardcore, and we're back with an all-time classic, though this comes from a repress. So Knightvision is one of the many names used by all-time hardcore legend, one of the originators of the Dutch Gabber sound, which is to say Patrick van Kerkhoven, also known most notably as Ruffneck, or DJ Ruffneck, who runs and has long run, though for a while ran a different label, but yes, the Ruffneck Records label, which he started in the early 90s, I think like 93, certainly by 94 it was already running. This track, which we're going to hear by his Knightvision alias, which more on that in a minute, is from 1995. So yes, Ruffneck, again, started the Ruffneck label, this legendary label of early Gabber music, which the particular flavor that he developed on his label and which other artists contributed to on his label is called Artcore, which is basically the Gabber sound but mixed with a lot of like reggae samples and in particular drum and bass rhythms in different sections. Now, he eventually, for arcane reasons, lost the copyright for his own label and the logo, the Ruffneck logo and the Ruffneck label, and at that point he created a different label named Enzyme, which moved in a different direction toward more like modern hardcore. I wouldn't say necessarily like mainstream or like Frenchcore, but again, it was like a more modern style of hardcore. It is much beloved. There are many great releases. I have a record, I think it's on Enzyme, but it's like him and Ophidian, and you know, there's great tracks on that label, but it was never as celebrated and beloved as the Artcore from his Ruffneck label. And then several years ago, like 2018, I believe, he had reacquired the rights to the Ruffneck label and logo, and so he resurrected the Ruffneck label and began making Artcore again, and the rest, again, is now history. And for the last several years, he's been playing gigs again as Ruffneck and doing all sorts of Artcore and sort of resurrecting the old sound. But another thing he did when he resurrected the Ruffneck label is he released a bunch of Ruffneck recollections, which are represses of those old Ruffneck records from the 90s, which is great because a lot of those, they command crazy prices on Discogs. They're really hard to acquire, and certainly acquiring a record from them in great condition for a reasonable price is nearly impossible. Luckily, I do have some of those classic Ruffneck releases, but one that I never had was Knightvision and his track Who Is It? Now, the thing with Knightvision as one of his aliases, there were a number of aliases where it was clearly known that, like, oh, that's just Ruffneck, that's one of the names that he uses, and indeed, he would often make different types of Gabber and Artcore under these different names, like Ectomorph and what's another one? Undercover Anarchist would be another one. So the Knightvision name was actually this big secret, and ultimately, you know, it was sort of kept under wraps by Ruffneck, and the label, like on the, eventually, you know, the website for Ruffneck, it would just say like, oh, it's the biggest kept secret of the label and so on. And there was a rumor that started that it was actually one of his girlfriends, and that it was a name that was used when he would collaborate with this girlfriend. Well, then many years later, it came out in an interview. I want to say this is like when he resurrected the label, like 2018 or something like that. He gave an interview where he said, oh, like it was always me, but like, you know, once this rumor got started, which he said he didn't start, he just figured, well, we'll kind of go with that and we'll just keep it this, you know, who is she? Like, who is Knightvision? So it was always Ruffneck, it was always Patrick van Kerkhoven, but ultimately it was kept under wraps for a very long time. So as a last point of interest before we start, there's a remix vinyl that came out in 2023, and it's like, who is the, what is it? I forget exactly the phrasing, but they take 3 tracks from the old school era and the original Knightvision releases. Who Is It? Humanoid, which I have on a couple different things. There was a Ruffneck's classic sublabel that came out in the early 2000s where they already were repressing some of the tracks from the original Ruffneck run like a decade earlier, and I have Humanoid on that as well. But there's, I forget what the other track name is, but it's like, who is the humanoid of whatever the third track name is, which I like the way they did that. But Who Is It is actually, all 3 tracks are actually slight remixes of the originals. And the most interesting remix to me is the remix of Who Is It, which is actually rephrased as Who Was It, which, again, I like that. Oh, it's a track from a long time ago, so not Who Is It, Who Was It? And I actually think Who Was It is better than this original Who Is It, because it changes the main synth riff just a little bit, but that that little synth riff change, I think, is actually an improvement. Nevertheless, Who Is It, the original, is an all-time classic, so let's hear it. This is by Knightvision, the track Who Is It? It's originally from 1995, though this is from a Ruffneck Recollections release that came out in 2019. And as I said, this is essentially by DJ Ruffneck, Patrick Van Kerkhoven, though at the time people thought it was by some mysterious lady. By the way, we're going to hear Statler and Waldorf in this. I'll talk more about that after. favorite part of the track. So, again, I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's an all-time classic. It's one that once I really started getting hardcore vinyl, which I've told the story before, but maybe not in a while. So yes, I got my turntables in '98, and by then I had already been going to some record shops because I had this sense that I'm gonna get turntables. So I got a number of records before I ever got turntables. But yes, very soon I started to get a handful of hardcore records, but I was a teenager and, going to parties and punk shows and so on, so I didn't have unlimited cash. So after a few months of starting to buy records of some different genres, I kind of had to pick one or two genres to really focus on. And because I was such a big fan of acid music, in particular acid techno and acid trance, those were the two genres that I eventually bought most records within. And even though, as I said, I had a dozen or so hardcore records, I just didn't get those nearly as often. And same with Goa trance and some other genres that I'm very fond of and was all the way back then. But it's only in more recent years, as I've gotten older and started to use Discogs and at least had a little bit more disposable income, that I've caught up on some other genres, including going back to tracks from the 90s, getting those original records, and in some cases, when the genres are still being pressed on vinyl and new tracks are coming out, which, even for Goa trance, that is still somewhat the case, but hardcore has definitely had more of a renaissance, both in general for the old hardcore, like Gabber sound, and specifically that kind of stuff on vinyl, which that type of stuff made now, but in the style of the 90s, is often called early hardcore, so shout out to all the original Gabber producers and also early hardcore producers, some of whom are the same people, but of course there's a younger generation who's making early hardcore now that, maybe they weren't there at the parties in the 90s, but they respect the sound and so on. In any case, the point is, when I began to get more hardcore vinyl around 2015, 2016, and eventually, especially after 2017, when I got in touch with Ruffneck, shout out to Roberto, and he helped me find some tracks on labels that he was associated with, like Mokum, and of his own label Overdrive, and so on. But yes, I started to get some of those classic hardcore records that I had always known about or wanted, this being one of those tracks, but again, it's not from the original Who Is It release, the Knightvision release from '95, it's a repress from 2019. So yes, I've gotten a lot more hardcore in recent times. I don't have that 2023 remix vinyl with the Who Was It, which the only reason that's not the case now, and I haven't given up on it, but a lot of the new stuff that Ruffneck has put out on his label in the last couple of years, if you don't get a copy right away, prices skyrocket because, they're much coveted, they tend to be sort of limited release, only a few hundred copies or whatever. And the ones that are on Discogs now for the Who Was It release, they're like €70 plus shipping. So for me out here in the States, we're talking at least $100 US, if not a little bit more. So, I don't have a great disposable budget on top of my monthly budget. So it's not something I've been able to get yet, but I haven't given up on it. But as I said, what I love about this track is all there in the remix. And there's two aspects that they tweak. One aspect that they tweak is, again, the synth riff. It's slightly different. It's a little bit less dissonant as the one here, and it's a bit more serious and, sort of, let's put our fists up in the air and charge toward the enemy position. It just kind of has a bit more of a dramatic sound, a bit less of a dissonant sound. The other major difference is the Statler and Waldorf sample. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, Statler and Waldorf in the old school Muppet Show, if you guys remember that, they were the two old guys who sat up in the box above the stage, to the side of the stage, and made fun of everybody, criticized everybody, said everybody was terrible. So number one, sampling them is hilarious. So the difference between Who Is It and Who Was It, in Who Was It, they say the bad things first. It's terrible, it's awful, like I hate it. And then they say, well, it's not, parts of it I liked, it was okay, it was great, it was wonderful. And so by the end of the sample, they're saying the opposite of what they started with. Well, Who Was It? It flips around. They start with, it's great, it's wonderful. And they're like, well, I didn't like it that much, it's terrible, it's awful. And then in the Who Was It, after it goes from good to bad in that sample, there's a boo, which, Statler and Waldorf would boo everyone. And if you don't know where the names come from, they're names of two famous hotels, which, as a kid, I didn't get why they were called that, and then I got older, and it's like, oh, the Waldorf Astoria. I was like, oh, wait, so, Waldorf? And then, oh, there's a Statler hotel? Okay. But in any case, the sample from Statler and Waldorf is flipped around. But in all the other elements, the drum and bass rhythms, that lead-in synth where it sort of rises up, and then it's that very, rapid fire kind of synth. It's all the same. So it's a very similar remix, but the little bit of tweaking that Ruffneck did with it, I think actually makes it a better tune. So maybe one day I'll have that one and we can talk about it. Let me know what you think of this all-time hardcore classic. I will see you next time. Peace.